All right, so moving on to accommodations. Now, accommodations section on your lesson plan is really incredibly important because it ensures that you are thinking through the process of what unique needs are in my classroom and how are you going to meet those specific needs of students. And so accommodations are changes in the classroom environment, curriculum, or teaching practices that allow students with specific learning needs to gain access to course content or to complete assignments. So, through methods of differentiation, a teacher is able to ensure that the classroom is an equitable space regardless of diagnosed or undiagnosed disabilities, as well as giftedness. So, we will talk about both the notion of what might be a disability, but what also might be something that requires some sort of extension for students as well in your classroom. Teachers are expected to attend to all learning needs of students. That should be a given for you during the planning process. So this requires a teacher to know what plans have been put into place by exceptional student coordinators and counselors, as well as what conditions are best for students based on your own observations. And so as we look at the different elements here that we will be talking about that make an appearance in our lesson plan template, there are some things that are going to be created by a coordinator in your school. And so, for example, you may have a special education teacher or a exceptional children coordinator or just a case manager who looks over particular students with IEPs and 504s. There's been a lot of paperwork that's already gone into it. It is not your responsibility to diagnose students with these because usually they have been already diagnosed. It may be your responsibility to report to them if you find that there's somebody who's gone undiagnosed and you have specific concerns with. But in general, this paperwork comes to you in the beginning of the school year, and you'll be able to know based on that paperwork what the specific goals and learning needs of these students are. In particular, these get lumped together. They are different. If you're curious about the difference between an IEP and a 504, you can see this on the chart over here. But they just come from different legalese and policies and that sort of stuff, and they definitely have differences. But we won't talk about that here in this particular presentation. The next section is going to be English language learners. Again, typically, hopefully, you have someone who is a coordinator of English as a second language or English language learners in your school, and oftentimes they are wonderful resources. Understand that an ELL, an English language learner, may not get pulled out of your class, but it is your responsibility to coordinate with your ELL coordinator or teacher in order to figure out what the specific needs of this student, what students are. It's also important, a lot of times they get lumped in as just Hispanic or Spanish-speaking students, and ELLs come from obviously all over the world, and so it may not be the case that just because you know Spanish that you'll be able to identify and translate everything into Spanish, for instance, because you may have someone who comes from a different part of the world and speaks a dialect, and so you'll have to figure out what are those different routines and strategies that you can apply with different English language learners throughout the world. So it's something that you'll need to consider. And then the other thing that comes typically, these first three will come from coordinators outside of your school. Giftedness is something that gets identified typically between elementary and middle school, and there are different classifications for giftedness. A mistake that a lot of teachers make is that they just believe that gifted students need extra work, and that is not the case. Gifted students can be gifted for many different reasons. They could be gifted for motivation, they could be gifted for creativity or the arts. They could be gifted in specific areas, just in math and science. And so whatever their level of giftedness is, whatever they've been diagnosed as, you need to be able to apply what you know about them and help them develop and push them in those particular areas. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Striving readers may have been identified by perhaps a reading specialist in your school. It may also be your responsibility to run some sort of reading record with students throughout the year to identify who your struggling or striving readers are. But these are people who are typically reading below grade level, and so you need to figure out ways that you're going to help them in particular in understanding a text. And then we identify in our lesson plan just other learning needs, things that haven't been identified. And it could be something that goes undiagnosed, like a child having difficulty focusing in small group work but hasn't been identified with ADHD, for instance. So we'll talk about a little bit of what we expect from you with the lesson plan and thinking about how to identify other learning needs. So if you look at my example from the giver, we'll start with IEPs and 504s and circle back around to other learning needs. So additional time to complete guided notes will be provided for a student with specific learning disability. Oftentimes you'll see this SLD, specific learning disability, described because it is not a diagnosis in IEP. It is a way of just saying this student has a particular need. So even though they may have dyslexia, it may not read that way on their IEP. It's just providing them with the goals as well as what sort of exceptions they get in the classroom. So they may get extra time with assignments, and you need to list that here in your lesson plan. A student with a kidney disease will be able to use the restroom as many times as needed based on 504. So you may have that. You could have a student with diabetes who is able to ask to leave the room if they're feeling lightheaded or to get a snack. So those are things that sort of fall under the 504. For striving readers will be purposefully paired with proficient readers during small group work, and so that's a strategy to help them learn from other readers who may be more advanced. Be careful. A lot of people will fall in the trap of saying, "Well, we're doing read alouds today, and that helps with my striving readers." And if you're doing that for everybody, it's really not a specific accommodation for students. So just be mindful of making sure that you're creating specific things for students with these needs. ELL support, I have one student whose first language is Russian, so I will meet with him during the career activity to ensure he understands the job on his index card. So maybe he won't know some of the more cultural elements, and so I will check with him there. Guided questions will be translated into Russian, and he will have the opportunity to respond in either English or Russian. So providing them with those accommodations and then getting and meeting perhaps with the coordinator to see how I might grade their work in particular. One student is classified as gifted based on her creativity. She will be provided the opportunity to illustrate characters in place of answering questions of characterization on the guided questions. So providing them not necessarily with additional work, but something that is more tailored to their giftedness, their creativity. So cycling back around to learning needs, one student often gets off task during independent work time. As I circulate, I will start with his group in order to check that he understands the expectations for the guided questions. So working specifically with a student who may just have difficulty focusing is a way of accommodating this particular student, not based on any particular diagnosis, but based on my own particular observations in class. So again, accommodations are incredibly important. It's worth noting that you will not necessarily have a class that has all of these different elements in it. And so if you have a class and you don't have any English language learners, you do not need to fill it in or make things up, obviously. So you must tailor this to the classes that you have and based on the specific needs of your students.